Namo Ramana. A very warm welcome to all the devotees of Delhi Ramana Kendra's Sunday satsang. I would now request Narayananji at the shrine to initiate the puja. Narayananji.
ओके सिस्टर ओम अच्युताय नमः वंदाय नमः ओम गोविंदाय नमः शुक्लांबरधरं विष्णुं शशिवर्णं चतुर्भुजं प्रसन्नवदनं ध्याये सर्वविघ्नोपशान्तिये अयमूर्त समुत्सर्दोऽस्मि मुकुन्दो बान्धवानां प्रणन्दो अयमूर्त समुत्सर्दोऽस्तु तदेव लग्नं सदिनं तदेव ताराबलं चन्द्रमं तदेव विद्याबलं दैवबलं तदेव लक्ष्मीविधेते तेङ्ग्रीं स्मरामि ओम ओम भुव ओम सुव ओम मह ओम जन ओम तप ओम सत्यम ओम तत्सौदर्भवर्ण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ओमावज्योतिर्समृतमुर्मोस्वरम् अमोपात समस्त दुर्द शैत्वारास्ति परमेश्वर प्रीत्यर्थं करिष्यमानिष्य कर्मणः निर्वेणं प्रसन्नतमादौ विघ्नेश पूजां करिष्ये पृथ्व्यां मेरुटुलसी सूर्यं चन्द्रकुर्मो देवता पृथ्वी दिया त्रिदा लोहादेवितं विष्णुनाथृदा त्वं सतारे मां देवी पुत्रं गुरुशासनम् आगमार्थं तु देवानां कमनार्थं तु रक्षासां खण्डारवं करामि यादव देवदवानलाञ्छनम् नमोपात समस्त दुर्द शैत्वरा परमेश्वर प्रीत्यर्थं निर्विघ्न सिद्ध्यर्थं माधव विघ्नेश्वर पूजां करिष्ये गणानां त्वा गणपतिं अवामहे कविं कवीनामुपमश्रवणं ज्येष्ठराजं ब्रह्मणां ब्रह्मणस्पते आनुसूनं पुष्यसारम् अस्मिन् दरिद्रबिम्बे महागणपतिं ध्यायामि महागणपतिम् आवाहयामि। ओम महागणपतिये नमः आसनं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः अर्घ्यं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः पाद्यं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः आस्मनीयं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः औपचारिकस्नानं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः स्नानानन्तरम् आस्मनीयं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः वस्त्रदार्थम् अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः यज्ञोपवीतार्थम् अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः गंधा धारयामि समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः गंधोपरियक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः अलंकरणार्थम् अक्षतां समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः हरिद्रा कुंकुमं समर्पयामि ओम महागणपतिये नमः पुष्पै पूजयामि ओम सुमुखाय नमः ओम एकदंताय नमः ओम कपिलाय नमः ओम गजकर्णकाय नमः ओम लंबोदराय नमः ओम विकटाय नमः ओम विघ्नराजाय नमः ओम विनायकाय नमः ओम धूमकेतवे नमः ओम गणाध्यक्षाय नमः ओम बालचंद्राय नमः ओम गजाननाय नमः ओम वक्रतुंडाय नमः ओम शूर्पकर्णाय नमः ओम हेरंबाय नमः ओम स्कंदमूर्जवाय नमः ओम सिद्धविनायकरे नमः ओम शंकर मोक्ष विनायकरे नमः ओम आतुपुर विनायकरे नमः ओम महागणपतिये नमः नानाविध परिमलपत्र पुष्पाणि समर्पयामि धूपार्थं समर्पयामि दीपार्थं समर्पयामि अक्षतां समर्पयामि तत्सोदरवर्ण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् देवसवितुर्वसुः सत्यं दौर्जन्यं प्रसञ्जामि अमृतत्वं स्वाहा ओम प्राणाय स्वाहा ओम अपानाय स्वाहा ओम ज्ञानाय स्वाहा ओम उदानाय स्वाहा ओम समानाय स्वाहा ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः पुण्यगण्डनाट्यचक्रे नैवेद्यं समर्पयामि मध्ये मध्ये पानीयं समर्पयामि अमृतोत्तरावसं समर्पयामि कर्पूरं समर्पयामि गणानां अवामे कविं कवीनां ज्येष्ठराजं ब्रह्मणां ब्रह्मणस्पदयां शृण्वन्तु तुलसीदासं महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनानन्तरम् आसमनीयं समर्पयामि महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः वक्रतुण्ड महाकाय सूर्यकोटि समप्रभ निर्विघ्नं कुरु मे देव सर्वकार्येषु सर्वदा गणपति प्रसादं सरसा प्रणमामि ओम भो ओम भुव ओम स्व ओम मह ओम जन ओम तव ओम सत्यं तत्सुदुर्भवाण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ओम आवज्योतिर्संगम ब्रह्मस्वरम ओमोपात समस्त दुर्द शैतवराशि परमेश्वर द्वितीयतम शुभे सोमने मूर्ते आद्य ब्रह्मण द्वितीय प्रार्थे श्रीवेदे वराहकल्पे वैवस्वत मन्वन्तरे अष्टाविंशतितमे कलियुगे प्रथमे पादे जम्बूद्वीपे भारतवर्षे भरतखण्डे मेरो दक्षिणे पार्श्वे सगाप्ते अस्मिन् वर्तमाने व्यावावृके प्रवादिनां षष्ट्या संवत्सराणां मध्ये शुभकृतुनाम संवत्सरे उत्तरायणे वसंत ऋतु ऋषभ मासे शुक्लपक्षे त्रयोदशी तिथियां शुभतिथौ भानुवासर युक्तायां विशाख नक्षत्र युक्तायां शुभ नक्षत्र शुभयोग शुभकरण एवं गुण विशेषिण विशिष्टायां अस्यां त्रयोदशी तिथियां शुभतिथौ मम जन्म पापस जन्म प्रति एतच्चन पर्यन्तं मध्ये संभाविधानं सर्वेषां भावानां सत्य अवलोकनार्थम् अस्माहं सहकुटुम्बानां क्षेम सद्धैर्य वीर्य विजय आयुरारोग्य ऐश्वर्याणाम् अभिवृद्ध्यर्थं समस्तमङ्गलाभ्यर्थं समस्त दुर्दोषशान्त्यर्थं रमण महर्षि प्रसादेन ज्ञानवैराग्य सिद्ध्यर्थं श्री रमण महर्षि पूजां करिष्ये तदंगम कलश पूजां च करिष्ये विघ्नेश्वरं यथास्थानं प्रतिष्ठापयामि शोभनार्थे क्षेमाय पुनरागमनाय च कलशस्य मुखे विष्णुमंडले कलशस्य मुखे विष्णुमंडले सुंदरात्रे कलशस्य मुखे विष्णु कंडे रुद्र समाधृत मूले तत्व सिद्धो ब्रह्मा मातृगणे संप्रदा कुशतु सागर सर्वे सप्तत्वा सुंदरा ऋग्वेद यजुर्वेद सामवेद प्रदरण गंगे सैन्य गोदावरी सरस्वती नर्मदे सिंधु कावेरी जलेस्मिन् सन्निधं गुरु अंगे सहिता सर्वे कलशाम्बु समाधृता आयान्तु देव पूजार्थं दुर्दर्श कारगा तंबूरा सागरोत्पन्नो विष्णु विष्णुकरे देवसे बांधने नमोस्तुते देवो देवालय प्रस्तुत जीवो देवस्थान अंजान निर्माल्यम सोयांगोने पूजे ओम सकलगुणात्म शक्तियुक्ताय योग पीडात्मने नमः आधार शक्तिये नमः मूल प्रकृतिये नमः आदिवराय नमः आदिगुरुमाय नमः अनंताय नमः पृथ्व्यै नमः आदित्यादि नवग्रह देवतोभ्यो नमः दशदिक्पालेभ्यो नमः गुरुर्ब्रह्मा गुरुर्विष्णु गुरुर्देवो महेश्वरः गुरुसाक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै से गुरवे नमः ओम अस्य श्री प्राणप्रतिष्ठा मंत्रस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वरा ऋषिदेव सामंतरवाणी संतांसी सकल जगत सृष्टि सम्मार्गारिणी प्राणशक्ति परादेवता आम बीजम हरिम शक्ति क्रोम कीलकम प्राणप्रतिष्ठापने विनियोग आम अंगुष्ठाभ्यां नमः हरिंद्रजनिभ्यां नमः क्रोम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः आम अनाभिकाभ्यां नमः हरिंगनिष्ठिकाभ्यां नमः क्रोम करलकुष्ठाभ्यां नमः आम हृदयाय नमः हरिं शिरसे स्वाहा क्रोम सिगाय वसट आम कौसायम हरिं नेत्रदाय वषट क्रोम अस्त्रदाय पट पूर्वस्वरूपति दिग्बंध ध्यानम रक्तांबोधिस्त बोधोलस तरुण सरुणसुर सरोज त्रिड़ा कराब्चे पासं गोदंड मिक्षुत्व मलिगुणमप्यंगसं पंचमाणात् विप्राणुसु कपालंतनिर्सिता आप्तिनवसोर्वटिया देवी बालार्गवर्णा बहुसुगरी प्राणशक्ति प्राण ओम आम हरिं क्रोम क्रोम हरिं आम अम यम रम लम वम सम शम हम हम सम हम सोम सोम हम स अस्यामूर्तौ जीवदृष्टियो अस्यामूर्तौ सर्वेन्द्रियाणि वाङ्मनस्वस्वत्र जीव्या प्राणवाक् पाणिपाद पायुपुष्टानि याकस्ति स्वस्ति सुगम सुरम दृष्टन्तु स्वाहा ओम अस्य श्री प्राणपृष्ठामृतस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वरा ऋषिरिति सामधर्मणि संतांसि सकल जगत सृष्टि सम्मार्गाणि प्राणशक्ति परादेवता आम बीजम हरिं शक्ति क्रोम कीलकम प्राणप्रतिष्ठापने विनियोग आम अंगुष्ठाभ्यां नमः हरिंगर्जनिभ्यां नमः क्रोम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः आम अनाभिकाभ्यां नमः हरिंगनिष्ठिकाभ्यां नमः क्रोम करलकुष्ठाभ्यां नमः आम हृदयाय नमः हरिं शिरसे स्वाहा क्रोम सिगाय वसट आम कौसायम हरिं नेत्रदाय वषट क्रोम अस्त्रदाय पट पूर्वस्वरूपति दिग्बंध असुनीदे पुनरस्मात् सत्स पुनः प्राणमी नोईदे भोगम जो पश्यमि सूर्यमुच्चरन् ब्रह्मदे मणयानुस्मृति आवायुदो भव सद्दाविदो भव सन्निहितो भव सन्निहितो भव अवगुण्डितो भव सुब्रतो भव सुप्रसन्नो भव सुमुखो भव वरदो भव प्रसिद्ध प्रसिद्ध स्वामिन् सर्वजगन्नाथ यावत् पूजावसानकं तावद्धूम प्रतिभावेन बिम्बेऽस्मिन् सन्निधं कुरु नमो भगवते श्री कुशेलाय नमो नमो श्री कुबेराय नमः नमो भगवते श्री कुशेलाय नमो नमो भगवते श्री कुबेराय नमः नमो भगवते श्री कुशेलाय नमो श्री कुबेराय नमः चतुर्वेदी वंदन पौरुषी परत्रपः लक्ष्मी प्रदश्रीमानवद ईश्वरा I will recite Bhagavan's Ramana Stotram. श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः गुरु ब्रह्मा गुरु विष्णु गुरुदेवो महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् पर ब्रह्मा तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः अपार सच्चि सुगुवारि राशोर्यशोर्य मात्रं भुवनं समस्तं गुणायुधं तं ब्रह्मणं कबीरं चिन्ताविर्नमृति चिन्तयामि ओम महोसेन जाताय नमः ओम श्री रमणाय नमः ओम गुरवे नमः ओम अखंड संविदागणाय नमः ओम महुजसे नमः ओम कारणोद्भवाय नमः ओम जगद्हितावताराय नमः ओम श्री भूमिनाथास्तलोचिताय नमः ओम पराशर कुलोतंसाय नमः ओम सुंदरातदवक्फलाय नमः ओम कमनीय सुचारित्राय नमः ओम सयायाम्बा सयायवते नमः ओम शोणासुर मौलिन मानसाय नमः ओम स्वर्णस्तगाय नमः ओम श्रीमद्वादशांत महास्त्रे रक्त विद्योदयाय नमः ओम महाशक्ति निवादेन प्रभुत्ताय नमः ओम परमार्थविदे नमः ओम दिव्यराय नमः ओम पितृपदान्वेषिणे नमः ओम इंदुमौलिना पितृपदे नमः ओम पितृदेष्ट सोणशैलं प्राप्ताय नमः ओम तपोमयाय नमः ओम उदासीनाय नमः ओम महायोगिने नमः ओम महोत्साहाय नमः ओम कुशाग्रदिये नमः ओम शांतसंकल्प संभ्रमाय नमः ओम सुसुंदृसे नमः ओम सवित्रे नमः ओम स्थिराय नमः ओम तपस्वीर सर्वंगाय नमः ओम बुल्लाभूज विलोचनाय नमः ओम चंद्रिकासिदासी मंडितानन मंडलाय नमः ओम सूदवाट्यां समासीनाय नमः ओम सूर्यदाकिर विप्रमाय नमः ओम वेद वेदांत तत्त्वज्ञाय नमः ओम चिन्मुत्रुने नमः ओम त्रिगुणाधिकाय नमः ओम विरूपाक्ष भुवावासाय नमः ओम विराजित सलाकृतिये नमः ओम उच्चित्तनयनाय नमः ओम पूर्णाय नमः ओम रसिदास तांडवाय नमः ओम गंभीराय नमः ओम परमाचार्याय नमः ओम सुप्रसन्याय नमः ओम अभयप्रदाय नमः ओम दक्षिणासी निवाय नमः ओम धीराय नमः, ओम दक्षिणाभिमुखाय नमः, ओम स्वराजे नमः, ओम महर्षिये नमः, ओम भगवते नमः, ओम ईट्याय नमः, ओम भूमविद्या विशारदाय नमः, ओम विमलाय नमः, ओम दीर्घदर्शने नमः, ओम आप्ताय नमः, ओम रुजमार्ग प्रदर्शकाय नमः, ओम समत्रुसे नमः, ओम सत्यत्रुसे नमः, ओम सत्याय नमः, ओम प्रशांताय नमः, ओम अमित विक्रमाय नमः, ओम सुकुमाराय नमः, ओम सदानंदाय नमः, ओम मृदुवासिने नमः, ओम दयार्णवाय नमः, ओम श्री सोणासुर युरुद्भूत स्कंदाश्रम निकेतनाय नमः, ओम सद्दर्शनोपदेष्टने नमः, ओम सद्भक्त वृंद परिप्लुताय नमः, ओम गणेश मुनिप्रिकेण सेवितान् तिसरोरुवाय नमः, ओम गीतोपदेश सारादि ग्रंथ संसिन्न संशयाय नमः, ओम वर्णाश्रम मदाधीताय नमः, ओम रसज्ञाय नमः, ओम सौम्याय नमः, ओम आत्मवदे नमः, ओम सर्वावरि मदस्थानां आराध्याय नमः, ओम सर्वसद्गुणिने नमः, ओम आत्मारामाय नमः, ओम महाभागाय नमः, ओम मातृमुक्ति विदायकाय नमः, ओम विनदाय नमः, ओम विनुदाय नमः, ओम विप्राय नमः, ओम मुनीन्द्राय नमः, ओम भावगोज्वलाय नमः, ओम दर्शनादक सम्मारणे नमः, ओम मौनेन स्वात्मबोधकाय नमः, ओम ऋचानिकर्षानित्याय नमः, ओम स्मरणाबंध मोचकाय नमः, ओम अंतस्मिर चंडांशवे नमः, ओम संसारार्वतारकाय नमः, ओम सोणादितिष्ठरे नमः, ओम आर्तविद्या प्रकाशकाय नमः, ओम अविच्युत निज प्रज्ञाय नमः, ओम नैसर्गिक महातपसे नमः, ओम कमंडरुद्राय नमः, ओम सुब्रगौविनवसनाय नमः, ओम गुहाय नमः, ओम दंडवाणीय नमः, ओम कृपापूर्णाय नमः, ओम पवरोग पिशक्पराय नमः, ओम स्कंदाय नमः, ओम देवतमाय नमः, ओम अमर्तयाय नमः, ओम सेनानीय नमः, ओम पुरुषोत्तमाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः, नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः, नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री कार्तिकाय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री मुरुगाय नमः, नमो भगवते श्री वल्ली दैवाने नमः, नमो भगवते श्री सुब्रमण्याय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री स्वामीनाथने नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री दक्षिणामूर्तिये नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री नटराजरे नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री भैरवरे नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री नंदी महेश्वराय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री शिव पार्वतीये नमः, ओम नमः शिवाय नमः, ओम नमः शिवाय नमः, ओम नमः शिवाय नमः, ओम शिवाय नमः, ओम शिवाय नमः, ओम शिवाय नमः। चिदानंदरूपम शिवोहम 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 चिदानंदरूपम चिदानंदरूपम शिवोहम 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 चिदानंदरूपम चिदानंदरूपम शिवोहम 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 चिदानंदरूपम। Oh, let us all recite Upadeshasaram. कर्तुराज्ञया प्रापदे फलं कर्म गिम्बरं कर्म दज्जडं कृहति महततो पदनकारणं फलमशाश्वतं गदनिरोधकम् ईश्वरार्पितं नेचया कृतं सिद्धशोधकं मुक्तिसाधकम् कायवाङ्मन कार्यमुत्तमं भूजनं जप चिन्तनं क्रमा जगतैसदी युक्तसेवनम् अष्टमूर्तिभृत् देवपूजनम् उद्दमस्तवा दुज्जमन्दद सिद्धजं जप ज्ञानमुद्दमम् आज्यधारया श्रोतसासमं सरलचिन्तनं विरलदबरं वेदभावना सौवमित्यसौ भावनाभिधा भावनीमदा भावशून्यस भावसुस्तुति भावनाबला भक्तिरुद्धमा इरुस्तरे मन स्वस्थता क्रिया भक्ति योग बोधा च निश्चितं वायुरोधना लीयते मन जालभक्षिव योधसाधनं सिद्धवायव सित्क्रियायुधा सागयोर्द्वयी शक्तिमूलगा लयविनाशने उभयरोधने लयकदम्बुनर्भवति नो मृदं प्राणवन्दना लीनमानसम् एकचिन्तनात् नासमेत्यद नष्टमानसो दृष्टयोगिन कृत्यमस्ति किं स्वस्थितं यद दृश्यवारिदं सिद्धमात्मन सिद्वदर्शनं तत्त्वदर्शनं मानसं दुविं मार्गणे हृदे नैव मानसं मार्गार्जवात् वृद्धयस्त्वहं वृद्धिमाश्रिता वृद्धयो मनो विद्यां मन अहमयं कुतो भवति चिनपद ऐपदत्यहं निजविसारणम् अहं विनाशवा यमहं दया स्फुरतीरस्वयं परमपूर्णसत् इदमहं पदा अभिक्यमन्वहम् अहं विलीनके अप्यल्यसत्तया विक्रयेन्द्रिय प्राणदीतम नामसेकसत् दज्जडं ससत् सत्त्ववासिका सिद्ध्ववेदरा सद्दया इति सिद्धयायहम् ईसजीवयोर्वेषदीपिता सस्वभावदो वस्तु केवलं वेषानद स्वात्मदर्शनम् ईशदर्शनं स्वात्मरूपत आत्मसंस्थिति स्वात्मदर्शनम् आत्मनिर्द्वया आत्मनिष्ठता ज्ञानवर्जिता अज्ञानहीनची ज्ञानमस्ति किं नादुमन्तरं किं स्वरूपमे आत्मदर्शने अव्यया भवा अपूर्णसित्सुखं बन्धमुक्त्यदि तम्बरं सुखं विन्ददीयजी विवस्तु दैविक अहमवेदकं निजविमानकं महति तं तवो रमणवागियं महति तं तवो रमणवागियं महति तं तवो रमणवागियम् अरुणाचल 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 अरुणाचल
Namo Ramana. A very warm welcome to all the devotees for Ramana Kendra Delhi's Sunday satsang with Mr. Michael James. He shall be speaking to all of us on Upadeshasaram. Since I have already outlined the genesis of Upadeshasaram and also introduced Mr. James a number of times, I would be skipping that and would request Mr. James to take over. Sir.
Namaskaram. Last month, I spoke about verses 16 and 17 of Upadeshasara. So this time I'm due to begin from verse 18. But in order to fully understand the import of verse 18, we need to understand it in the context. Upadeshasara, Bhagavan wrote, it is organized in a very systematic way, covering all the different various kinds of practice and how they all eventually lead to the practice of self-investigation. So in Vedanta, when we always go from the gross to the subtle, from the outer to the inner. For example, when we talk about the Panchakosha, the 5 sheaths, we talk about the grossest first. When we list them, we start from the grossest and go to the subtlest. Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya Kosha, Anandamaya Kosha. Each consecutive one is more subtle than the previous one. Likewise, when we talk about the Antakarana is said to have 4 functions. And when we talk about the 4 functions of the Antakarana, we go from the grossest to the subtlest. Manas, Buddhi, Chittam, Ahankaram. So there's a reason for this, because in Vedanta, always the external things are grosser. The deeper we go within, the more subtle it becomes. So Vedanta is a journey from the gross to the subtle, from the outer to the inner. So Bhagavan has wrote Upadeshasara in that same logical sequence. So he begins Upadeshasara in the first 2 verses. He's talking about karma in general. Karma is very external. It's action. It's doing. So that is gross, or relatively gross. Then, so in the first 2 verses, he talks about karma in general. Then from verse 3 onwards, he begins to talk about the path of bhakti. But the path of bhakti begins with karma, begins with doing, but not karmiya karma, but nishkarmiya karma. So from verse 3, Bhagavan starts to talk about nishkarmiya karma. That is more subtle than the karmiya karma, because it's more, the aim is more inward. So first in verse 3, he talks about, he says that in verse 2, he says, but karma does not give liberation. In fact, in Upadesha, in Tamil, he says it, vidu tarale, it does not give liberation. In Sanskrit, he says gati nirodhakam, it obstructs the liberation. Gati there means the goal or the liberation. But then he says, but if the action is done without desire for the fruit, but for the love of God, it will purify the mind and show the way to liberation. That's the import of verse 3. And then he begins to, so that's the beginning of the path of bhakti. But as I say, the path of bhakti begins with action. We begin from grosser and go to the subtler. So the path of bhakti begins with nishkarmiya karma, that action done for the love of God. And what are the actions we can do for the love of God? In verse 4, Bhagavan talks about there are 3 types of action. Well, there are 3 instruments of action: body, speech, and mind. And so there are 3 types of actions we can do: actions of body, actions of speech, and actions of mind. The actions of body that we do for the love of God are puja. The actions of speech that we do for the love of God are japa. The actions of mind that we do for the love of God is dhyana. So he says, he talks about these 3 types of action done by these 3 types of instruments. And he says in this order, each is superior to the previous one. What does he mean by superior? In the previous verse, in verse 3, he said, nishkarmiya karma will purify the mind. In Tamil, he says, and show the way to liberation. In Sanskrit, he says, mukti sadhakam. It's a means to liberation. It doesn't mean a direct means to liberation. It is an indirect means, because as he says in the Tamil, it shows the way to liberation. That is, when the mind is still relatively impure, it will be looking, what can I do to get liberation? So it's looking for action. But actually, liberation is not to be attained by doing anything, but just by being. But we have to start with doing, because that is where we always start from grosser and go to the subtler. Being is obviously subtler than doing. So the benefit of nishkarmiya karma done for the love of God is it purifies the mind. And the purified mind will then be able to grasp what is the path to liberation. So these three types of action we can do, the puja, japa, and dhyana, actions of body, speech, and mind, respectively. Bhagavan says in verse 4, each one is superior to the previous one. What does he mean by superior? In the context, he means it's more efficacious in purifying the mind. So from verse 3 onwards, we begin to talk about mind. So note how much Bhagavan is talking about mind from verse 3, either directly or indirectly, from verse 3 on to up to verse 18, the verse we're going to start talking about today. He's talking about mind. So in verse 3, he said that the nishkarmiya karma will purify the mind. Then what type of nishkarmiya karma? There's puja, japa, and dhyana. And in this order, each one is more efficacious in purifying the mind. Then in verse 5, he talks about puja. And then verse 6, he talks about japa. And in verse 6, he says, the best of all japa, that is better than japa done aloud. That's relatively gross. But japa done softly within the mouth is better. Better than japa done softly within the mouth is the mental japa. So again, we can see there, but we go from gross to subtle, and the subtler we go, the more efficacious it is. And he says the japa done by mind is dhyana. So that is meditation. That's an action of mind. Then in verse 7, he says, rather than the interrupted meditation, the uninterrupted meditation is more efficacious. Why? Because if we have love for God, we will not, when we are meditating on God, we will not allow our mind to be distracted by other thoughts. If our mind is often distracted by other thoughts, that means we're more interested in other things than we are in God. So the more the love grows, the more the love matures and becomes deeper and more intense, the more uninterrupted our meditation will be. But so up to verse 7, he's been talking about karma, actions of body, speech, and mind. In verse 8 is where he begins to switch from the action of mind to the state of just being. That is what he says in verse 8 is, rather than, in Tamil he uses the term anya bhava. In Sanskrit, I think it's bhavana bida. That is, rather than meditation on God as something other than ourselves, meditation on him as not other than ourselves. That is meditation in which we understand that he is I, and therefore meditate not on something other than ourselves, but on ourselves alone, on I alone. In Tamil, he says, "Naitim urutamam." That is the best among all. In Sanskrit, he says, "Pavani mata." It's more. That implies in the context that it's more purifying. So the most purifying thing we can do is not to meditate on God as something other than ourselves, but to meditate on him as ourselves alone. So long as we're meditating on God as something other than ourselves, our attention is moving away from ourselves towards the thought of God, either to a name or form of God. So that is an action. But when we understand that God is that which is shining in our heart as I, our attention turns back within. When the attention turns within, that is not a doing, but a state of being, because when the mind rises, stands, and flourishes by attending to things other than itself, as Bhagavan implies in verse 25 of Uladu Napadu. He says, what is the nature of ego? Ego is the essence of the mind, as we'll see later today. The nature of ego is a formless phantom. It's got no form of its own, and it's got no substance of its own. So how does ego come into existence? He says, grasping form, it comes into existence. Grasping form, it stands. Grasping and feeding on form, it flourishes abundantly. Leaving form, it grasps form. Then he says, "Tedinal otum piticum." If it seeks, it takes flight. That means if the mind, instead of grasping form, tries to grasp itself, tries to see who am I, it will thereby subside and disappear. So the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by grasping things other than itself. Because the ego is formless, so all forms are other than itself. Forms there means any object or phenomena, whether gross objects like the gross objects of the world, or subtle objects like the thoughts, feelings, and so on in the mind. So the nature of it, so long as we're in Anya Bhava, when we're meditating on God as something other than ourselves, our attention is moving away from ourselves towards the name or form of God. That is a mental activity. But when we turn our attention back within to see who am I, the mind will thereby subside. So that is not an activity, but a cessation of activity. As he makes clear in the next verse, verse 9, in which he says, by the strength of that bhava, that implies the ananya bhava, the meditation on oneself alone, on nothing other than oneself, by the strength of that ananya bhava, one stays in sat bhava, the state of just being. So that is how, by turning our attention within, we leave behind action and return to our natural state of just being. And in the Tamil version, Bhagavan says, being in that state of being, which transcends bhavana. In this context, bhavana means meditation as a mental activity. So in the state of being, we have transcended the mental activity, and Bhagavan says, Parabhakti Tattva, that is the nature of supreme devotion. So the pinnacle of the path of devotion is to turn our attention within and thereby be as we are. That is surrendering ourselves to God. That is the pinnacle of the path of devotion. So Bhagavan's path of Atmavichara is the culmination of the path of bhakti. Eventually, when we come to understand God is not something other than ourselves, God is the reality of ourselves. What we actually are is God. So our attention turns within, and thereby we surrender ourselves. We give up this separate existence, this ego or mind. We surrender to him and remain as we actually are. And then he emphasizes in the next verse, verse 10, but being in the place from which we rose. What rose? It's the ego or mind that rose. So it implies the ego or mind being in its source. In other words, not ceasing to rise. That is karma, bhakti, yoga, and jnana. So here he's brought us from the grosser actions of body to the actions of speech to the actions of mind. So mind is a theme running from verse 3 onwards. There's the mind is referred to in most of the verses. Then in verses 11 to 15, that is about the path of yoga. Just as in the first 10 verses, he explains how the path of bhakti, how the path of bhakti begins with karma, the nishkarmiya karma, but it leads eventually to just being. It leads to self-investigation, and self-investigation results in the state of just being, and that is the supreme devotion. Likewise, he shows in verses 11 to 15, he's showing how yoga by itself cannot lead to liberation. Yoga is useful only to the extent to which it leads us to the path of self-investigation, because only by self-investigation can we attain liberation. So in verses 11 and 12, Bhagavan explains that by controlling the breath, that's a way to control the mind. That is, by subduing the activity of the breath, we subdue the activity of the mind, because breath and mind are like two branches which come from have one common source. So if we subdue the activity of the mind, the breath is thereby calmed. If we subdue the activity of the breath, the mind is thereby calmed. So this controlling the breath, subduing the activity of the breathing, is a way to control the mind. But it simply controls the mind, it doesn't destroy the mind. So in verse 13, he says, but dissolution of mind is of two kinds, laya and nasa. What is dissolved in laya will rise again. What is dissolved in nasa will not rise again. So our aim is, in that verse, he's indicating that our aim is not manolaya. Our aim is manonasa. Yoga can only lead as far as manolaya. It cannot lead to manonasa, because what is yoga? Yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. It is restraining or curbing the activity of the mind. When the activity of the mind is curbed, the mind will subside in laya. We can see this every day when we fall asleep. When we become too tired to continue thinking, but the thinking subsides, and we sink into sleep, which is just a state of manolaya. But because it's a state of manolaya, next morning, sure enough, we wake up again, or we begin to, in the middle of our sleep, we begin to dream. So from laya, the mind will always rise again. So our aim is not laya, but nasa. So how to bring about nasa? By controlling the chitta vrittis, the activity of the mind, by means of pranayama and other yogic techniques, we can reach the state of manolaya. But how to get to the state of manonasa, the permanent destruction of the mind, that is what Bhagavan teaches us in verse 14. In the Tamil verse of verse 14, he says that the mind that is restrained by breath control, when one sends it on the orvari, the path of investigation, its form will die. In Sanskrit, he says ekachintana. Ekachintana, if viewed superficially, we can say one thought, but that is not it actually has a much deeper meaning. What is the one that we need to think about? That one which is ekameva advaitiyam, the one only without a second. That is our self, our real nature. So ekachintana there implies atmachintana. By thinking, by turning our attention back to ourself, the mind will thereby be destroyed. So in yoga, we just withdraw our mind from other things, whereas in Bhagavan's path of jnana, we turn our attention back to ourselves. When we turn our attention back to ourselves, it's automatically withdrawn from other things. But if we merely withdraw our attention from other things, we subside in laya. So this is, Bhagavan is clarifying here the distinction between the path of yoga and the path of jnana. The path of yoga is useful to the extent to which it leads us to this path of jnana, the path of turning within. So in verse 11 and 12, he's talking about the mind and the breath. So mind is mentioned in both those verses. In verse 13, he doesn't mention the mind explicitly, but implicitly it's there, because when he talks about dissolution of what? It means dissolution of mind. In verse 14, in Tamil, he definitely refers to the mind explicitly. Let me just see what he says in the Sanskrit version. In the Sanskrit version of verse 14, yes, he says manasam. Prana bandhanat lina manasam ekachintana chintanat nasam eti atta. So the mind that is settled down by restraining the breath, it will reach annihilation by thinking of the one. The one means Atma, our real nature, the one only thing that actually exists. Ekameva dvaitiyam, the one without a second. So here 14 he refers to mind, and in 15 he also talks about mind. That is the mind of the yogi, of the exalted yogi, who's the mind that is destroyed. But in the Sanskrit, he says, Nashta Manasa Utkrishta Yoginaha Kritya Asti Kim Swastim Yattaha. Sorry, I'm not very good at pronouncing these things, but that means the mind annihilated by the exalted yogi. What is there to be done because of standing as as self, that implies that when the mind is annihilated, there's no further action to do. Because why does he mention action here? Because he began Upadesha Undya, or Upadesha Sara, by talking about karma. So eventually, when the mind is destroyed, there's no further action to be done, no further karma to be done. Why? Because we are remaining in our natural state. We're in the state of swastiti, being as we actually are. So in each of these verses, in most of these verses, he's talking about the mind, if not explicitly, by implication. So from verse 16 onwards, he begins to talk about the path of jnana. But since he's been talking so much about the mind in the previous verse, he begins to talk about the path of jnana with reference to the mind. So in verse 16, he says, Drisya Varitum, kept back from what is seen, Chittam Atmanaha Chitva Darshanam. Chittam here means mind. The mind seeing its own chitva, its own nature of awareness, that is tattva darshanam, that is seeing the reality. The implication is the mind's own chitva is itself tattva. What is real? Only the mind itself is not real, it's chitva, its essential nature as awareness, that is what is real. So when the mind sees its own real nature as awareness, that is seeing what is real. So in these two verses, in this verse, he talks about mind. Likewise, in verse 17, he says, Manasam tu kim, margane krite, neva manasam, margamarjavat. That means when investigation is done, what the mind actually is, there is no mind at all. This is the path because of its straightness. So up to here, he's been talking about the mind. And in this verse 17, he specifically talks about investigating the mind. In verse 16, he talked about the mind knowing its own chitva. In Tamil, he says its own form of light. That means the fundamental awareness, I am. In verse 17, he just says when investigating the mind, when the mind is investigated, when investigation is done, what the mind actually is. In Tamil, he says, Manatin urve maravadu chava, when one, without forgetting, when one investigates the form of the mind. So what's he mean by the form of the mind, or what the mind is? That is why I've explained all this up to here, is to explain the purpose of verse 18. In verse 18, he clarifies what is meant by the mind, because mind is a very tricky word, because we use mind in slightly different sense in different contexts. For example, when we talk about the antakarana, for example, we talk about manas, buddhi, chittam, and ahankaram. So buddhi, is clear what that is. Buddhi is the intellect. Chittam is the will, or the vasanas. Ahankaram is the I that identifies all these and says, I am this mind, I am this buddhi, I am this chittam, that identifies itself with all the five sheaths. So what is meant by mind there, in the context of the antakarana, manam means the grosser functions of the mind. Likewise, when we classify the five sheaths, the annamaya kosha, pranamaya kosha, then comes manamaya kosha. Manamaya kosha in that context means the grosser functions of the mind. That is perception, memory, thinking, all the functions of the mind other than the intellect, which is the judging and discriminating and reasoning faculty of the mind, and other than chittam, which is the will, all the vasanas, the likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, and so on, and other than the the subtlest element of the mind, which is the ahankara, the ego, that which which appropriates all the other 5 sheaths and says, I am this body consisting of these 5 sheaths. So the function of ego is to identify itself. That is that abhimanam, identifying itself with each of the 5 sheaths. So in verse 18, Bhagavan, and also, I'm talking about the different senses in which the term mind is used. Often we use the term mind as a general collective name for the totality of all thoughts. But we also use the mind, we say it's the mind that knows everything. So we're talking about the mind in different senses. So but what is meant by mind, Bhagavan is clarifying here in verse 18. This is the purpose of verse 18. What he says in Tamil is ennangale manam, thoughts alone are mind. Yavinam, of all, that implies of all thoughts, nan ennum enname moolamam, but thought called I alone is the root. Yanam manam enal. That means what is called the mind is I. The implication there is, but we often use the term mind as a collective term to refer to the totality of all thoughts. But what the mind essentially is only this first thought called I. This first thought called I is what is otherwise referred to as ego. And that alone is the root of the mind. So what the mind essentially is only I. That is, all other thoughts, other than this first thought I, they come and go. But no other thought could come or go without this first thought I. Why is that? Because the first thought, this first thought I is quite unlike all other thoughts, because all other thoughts are objects. The thought called I is the subject. That is, other thoughts do not know themselves. If you think any thought, think of any object or any action or anything. If you think of anything, does that thought know itself? No, it doesn't. Who knows the thought? I know it. So it's the first thought I is the only thought that is endowed with awareness. That is why it's often described as chit jada granti. But because this first thought I, as Bhagavan said, it is that I that is always aware of itself as I am this body. This body here means not just the physical form of the body, all the 5 sheaths. All these 5 sheaths, as Bhagavan will clarify later in verse 22, all of them are jada, and therefore they are asat. Jada means they are not aware. Asat means they do not actually exist. They seem to exist only in the view of ego. Ego is a mixture of I am, which is the awareness, and the body, which is jada. So it is the awareness is chit, the body is jada. So the not but ties these together, or the not formed by the seeming entanglement of chit and jada, is what is called ego, chit jada granti. So ego is the only thought that is endowed with awareness. So all other thoughts exist only in the view of ego. So without ego, no other thought can exist. So though the term mind is often used as a collective noun to refer to all thoughts, what the mind essentially is only the first thought I. That is the import of this verse. So in the previous verse, Bhagavan said we need to investigate the mind. Here he's clarifying, what is it we need to investigate? We don't need to investigate all the other thoughts. There are some people who believe watching thoughts is the path of jnana. That is not so. That is it is often said, but we are the witness of the mind. The term witness is the Sanskrit term for that is sakshi. Sakshi is used in 2 senses in the older texts. Sakshi is used both in the sense of what knows other thoughts, what knows things, but the witness as the knower of other things is ego, the first thought I. But witness is our real nature, Atmaswarupa or Brahman, is also referred to as witness. It's referred to as Sarvasakshi so it's the witness of all. So, but there, as Bhagavan clarified, when the term witness is used to refer to our real nature, it doesn't mean that our real nature is knowing other things. What it means is it's in the presence of our real nature that all other things exist. So Bhagavan often said, in that deeper sense, Sakshi means sanadhi, means presence. The presence of what? The presence of our real nature, the fundamental awareness I am. But because this term Sakshi is used, some people come to the wrong conclusion, but if we witness our thoughts, we are thereby remaining as Brahman. That is not so. That is a misunderstanding. So when Bhagavan says we have to investigate the mind, he's not talking about investigating other thoughts. The only thought we need to investigate is this first thought I, because that is the essence of the mind. That is the root of the mind. So that's what he's clarifying here. In the Sanskrit version, for poetic reasons, Bhagavan puts what is logically the first sentence as the second sentence. That is what he says in Sanskrit is Brittaya tu aham brittim asrita. That's the first sentence, but logically it's the second sentence. Then the second sentence, which is logically the first sentence, vrittaya mana. That means thought. Vrittaya is a plural, so it means thoughts are mind. So that's the same as he says in Tamil, enangale manam. That is, thoughts alone are mind. So the thoughts as collectively are mind, but that in the first sentence, that too means but. But Brittaya, the thoughts, depend on asrita aham brittim, the thought, the I thought, or the thought I. So of all the thoughts, the first thought is the thought I. All other thoughts depend on this first thought I. Why? Because they seem to exist only in the view of this first thought. When we don't rise as ego, no other thoughts can exist, because it's only in the view of ego, or thought I, but other thoughts exist. Therefore, he concludes the verse, vidhi here means know, aham mana. Know that aham is the mind. That aham here is referring to the thought I, the ego. So what the mind essentially is only ego. So, but why I went into this long preamble is to explain the context in which Bhagavan says this, why Bhagavan says what he says here in verse 18. Because till now, he's hardly mentioned I at all. In verse 8, he mentions I in the context of sohamitya so, that is meditation on what is not other with the understanding that God is I. That doesn't mean that we meditate he is I. Understanding that he is I, what do we meditate on? If he is I, then how to meditate on him? To meditate only on I. So it's not meditating on the thought he is I, it's meditating on the I, but is he. So that's the only place up till prior to this verse where Bhagavan mentioned I. Up till this verse, he was talking only about mind. The subtlest thing he was talking about was mind. But what the mind essentially is only ego. And it is ego that we need to investigate. When Bhagavan says in the previous verse, manasam tu kim margane krite, the manasam he's referring to is only I, the ego. That is what we need to investigate. Does anyone have any questions on this, or shall I go on to the next verse now? Okay.
We do not have any questions here, sir.
Okay, then I'll go on to the next verse.
Quickly check on YouTube if we might have any questions there. Just give me 1 minute, sir. Sorry, the YouTube page is getting a little hung.
I see there's one question here. I think it's in the Zoom chat. I think.
Okay, it may have come to you directly.
Yes,
sir.
I think it's come as a direct message to me.
Please
Pradeep Kumar has written, I want to know the first step for self-inquiry. Can you guide me to the path? Right, okay. That is what Bhagavan is talking about here. That is from verses 16, 17, 18, 19 are all about the how to investigate ourselves. The first thing to understand is whatever words Bhagavan has used are just pointers. What is our real nature and how to investigate our real nature is beyond thoughts and words. So it cannot be adequately expressed in words. So we need to recognize that the words Bhagavan has used are pointers. That is why Bhagavan said, ultimately, the truth can be revealed not by words, but only by silence. And that silence we can find only deep within our own heart. But because silence is our real nature. So whatever words Bhagavan has used, they're all just pointing us in that direction. But we can discover how to investigate ourselves only by trying to investigate ourselves. So let us consider the clues. I mean, Bhagavan has in so many places given so many pointers for us to this path. Let's consider verse 16. Well, okay, let's begin with verse 8. In verse 8, Bhagavan in Tamil, he talks about Rabhavan Anya Bhava, Ananya Bhava. Ananya Bhava means meditation on what is not other. And he clarifies what he means by that by saying, Avanahamaham, Sohamityaso, that is, in which he is I. So with the understanding that God is that which is shining in our heart as I, we should meditate only on I. So that's the first clue Bhagavan gives in verse 8. In verse 14, he gives a clue. In Tamil, he says, if the mind is sent on Orvari. Orvari has two meanings. Or means orum, the path of investigation. It also means the one path. The one path means the path of self-investigation. So what he refers to there is the path of investigation. Investigating what? Only investigating ourselves. So the clues are given, but he really begins to clarify what is the practice from verse 16 onwards. In verse 16, he says, I'll talk about from the Sanskrit version. Drisya varitum. That means kept back from what is seen. What is to be kept back? The mind, the chittam. Chittam, he's using here chittam not in the specific sense of will, but in the broad sense of mind in general. So the mind has to be kept away from what is seen. So long as our attention is going out towards what is seen, we cannot know what we actually are, because when the mind is going outwards, that which is aware of anything other than itself is ego or mind. So by allowing our attention to go outwards, we are nourishing and sustaining ego. So first, we need to keep the mind away from other things. But as Bhagavan has clarified, merely keeping the mind away from other things, that is the path of yoga. chitta vritti nirodha. If you keep your attention away from, if you merely keep your mind away from drisya, away from everything that is seen, that means all objects or phenomena, that will lead to a subsidence of the mind, but the mind will subside only in laya. So merely drisya varitum on its own is not it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. What is necessary and sufficient is what he expresses in the next part of the verse. Chittam atmanaha chitva darshanam. The mind seeing its own chitva. What does chitva mean? Chit, as we know, means pure awareness or pure being. So chitva we can take as that tva has the same significance as ness in English. It like awareness. So it's a chitva, but because the noun in English is awareness, we can't say awarenessness. So we have to take it as the nature of awareness. So what is our essential nature? Our essential nature is just that fundamental awareness I am. That is the awareness of our own existence. Awareness of other things is not real awareness, because awareness of other things comes and goes. In waking and dream, we're aware of so many other things. And what the other things that we're aware of are constantly changing. So awareness of other things is not the real awareness, because it's constantly changing. The real awareness is only the awareness that never undergoes any change. That is the fundamental awareness I am. That is Satchit, the awareness of our own being. So what he refers to here as Chitva is that essential awareness, that Satchit, that fundamental awareness I am. So we need to see that. Seeing, obviously, we can't see it as an object. It's not like seeing something with the eyes. If we go to a temple and we have darshan of God in the temple, we are seeing an external form. But the darshanam he's referring to here is not an outward darshanam. It is looking, in order to see our own awareness, we need to look, we need to turn our mind back on itself. We need to turn our attention back within, back to see who am I. So darshanam here is not the gross darshanam seen with our eyes, but the subtle inner darshanam, as Bhagavan has expressed it beautifully in verse 44 of Arunachaksharam Ranamalai. That is, in that verse, Bhagavan reveals to us what Arunachala taught him. Arunachala is in the form of a mountain. So Arunachala doesn't teach in words. Arunachala teaches through silence. But what Arunachala taught Bhagavan through silence, Bhagavan has revealed to us in words. What he says in verse 44 is Tirambiyaham. Tirambiyaham means turning within. Tanne dinam ahakankan. See yourself daily. Daily there means constantly, repeatedly, throughout the day. See yourself daily with the ahakan. Ahakan means the inner eye. What is that inner eye? It's the eye of attention. So we need to turn our attention within to see ourselves, to see our own. What is meant by ourself there is what he refers to here as chitva, our own real nature as awareness. That is what we need to see. And if we see that, he says in that verse, terium, it will be known. What will be known? In the previous verse of Aksharam, he says, tane tattvam. Oneself alone is tattva. So we ourselves are the tattva. So here he says in verse 16 of Upadeshasara, when the mind seeing its own chitva is seeing tattva. Tattva means what is real, the reality, what actually exists. So because sat is chit and chit is sat. So chitva is chit and tattva is sat. So since seeing chit is seeing sat, it implies. So the practical clue Bhagavan is giving us here is that we need to we need to withdraw our attention from external forms and focus it on ourselves. We don't actually need to worry about Drisya Varitam, because if we turn our attention within to see who am I, automatically we're withdrawing our attention from other things. That is why Drisya Varitam is an adverbial clause. It's a subsidiary clause. It's very clear in the Tamil version. He says, Veli vidayangale bittu. That means leaving external phenomena. Vidayam is a Tamil form of Vishaya. So Veli Vishaya, it means all external phenomena. Does that mean we can hold on to internal phenomena? No, because though for poetic reasons, he talks about external phenomena, we have to understand all phenomena, all Vishayas are external to ourselves, in the sense that they are anya, they're other than ourselves, so they're extraneous to ourselves. So withdrawing our mind from all Vishayas, from all Drisya, but as I say, that is an adverbial clause. I don't know the Sanskrit grammar so well, but Tamil grammar, bittu is an adverbial participle. So Veli Vedangale bittu is an adverbial clause. It's not the main clause. The main clause is Manam tan oli uru ordale umme unichiyam. That is Manam tan oli uru ordale. It means the mind knowing its own form of light. Its own form of light implies its own nature as awareness. So what he describes in Sanskrit as chittam atmanaha chitvadarshanam is what he describes in Tamil as manam tan oli uru ordale. It's almost exact translation, except that in Tamil he refers to chitva metaphorically as form of light. That means the light of pure awareness. And in Sanskrit, he says that is tattva darshanam. In Tamil, he says that is unme unachi. Unme unachi, we can take either as awareness of reality or real awareness. We can take either way. And it amounts to the same. What is real awareness? Awareness of reality. And what is reality? Only our own form of light, our own chitva. So if when we read these verses, we need to think very carefully about it. Superficially, there may seem to be, Bhagavan is not giving us much clue here, but when we think about it deeply, it's very clear what Bhagavan is saying here. He's saying, firstly, our attention needs to be withdrawn from other things. Secondly, our attention needs to be fixed on ourselves. These are not two separate processes. If we merely withdraw our attention from other things, we'll subside in laya. But if we withdraw our attention from other things by focusing our attention on ourselves, on our own fundamental awareness, I am, automatically our attention is thereby withdrawn from other things. And by that, then we are seeing what is real. And only by seeing what is real will the mind be destroyed. So here he's given us a very clear pointer to the practice. It is withdrawing our attention from other things and focusing our attention on ourselves. Which, as I say, is not actually two different things. If we focus our attention on ourselves, it's automatically withdrawn from other things. Then in verse 17, again, he says, Manasam tu kim magane krite. That means when investigation, magane here means investigation, krite means is done. When investigation is done, manasam tu kim. What tu here is used in the sense of as an intensifier. It means actually. So manasam tu kim means what this mind actually is. What do we need to investigate? What this mind actually is. That doesn't mean that we ask the question, what is this mind? It means that we look within to see what the mind actually is. But what does he mean here by mind? is what he clarifies in the next verse, verse 18, the verse I've spoken about today, in which he says, what the mind essentially is the first thought I. So investigating the mind, investigating what is this mind means investigating what am I. We're not investigating any other thoughts which are drishya. We are to investigate the reality of the seer, the drik. So Bhagavan describes here as investigating the form of the mind, or investigating what is the mind, means investigating who am I. It's investigating the one essential thought of the mind, the root thought of the mind, namely the thought called I. And that thought called I is, as I said, it is chit jada granti. It's a mixture of pure awareness, chit, I am, and the adjuncts, this body, which is jada. When we are investigating ourselves, though Bhagavan often said, investigate, the ego should investigate itself, or we should investigate what is this I thought, he also clarified, when we're investigating this I thought, what we're actually investigating, we're not investigating the adjuncts, the jada portion, we're investigating only the chit portion. So in effect, we are attending only to chitva, our nature as awareness, our fundamental awareness I am. So turning our attention away from other things, back towards I am, that is the path of self-investigation. So I hope this is, Pradeep, you asked, I want to know the first step for self-inquiry. This is the first step and the last step. That is, this is a one-step path. The step is our attention, which is normally flowing outwards, we are turning it back to face within, to face ourself alone. Obviously, ourself is not an object. So we are accustomed to attending to objects. So when we begin to practice, many of us try to look for what is this I, where is this I? And some people come back and say, oh, I looked, but I couldn't find the I. That's as if there are two eyes. One eye is looking for some other eye. The eye that says, I couldn't find the I, is the I we should be attending to. So we are not actually looking for the I. We are trying to, we are looking at I. We're looking at ourselves. We are trying to focus our attention on ourselves because we always know I. But I is something far more subtle than other things. So at first we may have difficulty fixing our attention on this very subtle I. People often say it's very elusive, this I. So for people who have difficulty at first, understanding what it means to be self-attentive, Bhagavan gave a simple practical clue. He said, even if you go on thinking I, it will lead to that place. Why does he say that? Because he doesn't mean we should meditate on the word I. Because obviously the word I is different in different languages. In Sanskrit, it's aham. In Tamil, it's nan. In English, it's I. So in each language, there's a different word. So it's not the word I that Bhagavan wants us to think of. When we think of the word I, in whatever language we're familiar with, any word we use refers to something. If you say sky, it brings a certain thing to our mind. If you say clouds, it brings something else to our mind. If you say walking, it brings a certain action to our mind. So every word brings to our mind what that word refers to. So when we say the word I, what is that word I referring to? So if we are not merely to meditate on the word I, but just think the word I and try and see what is this word I referring to. Superficially, we refer to this body as I, or we refer to the mind as I. But if we go deeper, this I is just the awareness, but knows this body of mind. So we can find out how to be self-attentive only by trying to be self-attentive. That is attending to ourself alone. That is the practice of self-investigation. Bhagavan has clearly said in Nana, in the 16th paragraph, he says, sada kalamum manam atma sada kalamum manate atma vil set vetirapataku, always fixing the mind in oneself. Oneself means that fundamental awareness I am. That is only to that practice is the name Atma Vichara apply. So in other words, fixing our mind on ourself, in other words, being self-attentive, that alone is the practice of self-investigation. So how to be self-attentive, we can find out only by trying to be self-attentive. If you've never ridden a bicycle in your life, and someone explains to you how to ride a bicycle, you can't learn to ride a bicycle simply by listening to lectures on how to ride a bicycle. The only way to learn to ride a bicycle is to get on a bicycle. At first, you'll wobble and fall, but slowly, you'll get the hang of it. And after a few days of practice, it becomes second nature to you. You're able to, it's very easy and even if you don't ride a cycle for 50 years, after 50 years, if you're given a cycle and get on it, you'll be able to ride it because once you've got the hang of it. Likewise with this practice, we have to try to be self-attentive in order to familiarize ourselves. So the only way to learn how to investigate ourselves is to investigate ourselves. But Bhagavan has given us plenty of clues, plenty of pointers. I think there's...
So we have two more questions coming in from YouTube. One is from Neera Kashyapji. The other is from Mr. Sushil Mutwani. Okay. Now, just trying to balance our available time and the two questions. Would you like to respond to them very briefly in the next 5 minutes so that we are able to conclude by, and then take them up in detail, perhaps in the next session?
Okay, that would be fine.
Would you want me to read the question out?
I can see it here. I can see it here. If I thought is the Sakshi thought, then why is the self also referred to as Sakshi? You have explained this, but I'm not clear about the distinction. That is, words are used in the same word has a different meaning in different contexts. It's the same even in the ordinary sense. Many words we use for ordinary worldly purposes, but the exact meaning of the word is determined by the context in which it's used. So but the aim of the Vedanta Sastras, when they use this word Sakshi, is to draw our attention away from what we are seeing back to our self-seer. So first there's this process of Drisya Viveka. We first distinguish, as in the text it says, what is it that's seeing all these objects of the world? It's the eye. But what is the eye that is seeing the eye? It is the mind. And what is the mind? But the mind is just thought. So what is the I means EYE, but is seeing that? It is Atman. Atman in that context means ego, because it's only ego that knows all the thoughts and the objects and everything. By turning our attention back to ego, if we attend to ego keenly enough, what do we find? We find what we actually are. If supposing you're walking along a path with Bhagavan at dusk, it's quite dark, but there's still enough light to see objects, but you can't see very clearly. And you see something lying on the path, and to you it looks like a snake, so you're afraid. Bhagavan tells you, no, it's not a snake, it's only a rope. But still you're afraid because to you it looks so snake-like. So Bhagavan assures you, no. He knows the only way to get rid of your fear is for you actually to see that it's a snake. So how to see that it's a snake? I mean, to see that it's a rope, you have to look at it very carefully. So Bhagavan says, I'm here with you. I'll make sure the snake doesn't harm you. Just look at it very carefully. If we look very carefully at the snake, what do we see? Oh, it's not a snake, it's just a rope. Likewise with ego. If we look at ourselves very carefully, now we seem to be ego. But if we seem to be ego because we're attending to other things. If we turn our attention back towards ourselves to see who am I, what previously seemed to be ego is found to be just pure awareness, which is what we actually are. So the witness in the sense of the knower of other things is ego. But the reality of ego is the pure awareness. Pure awareness is not aware of anything other than itself. Pure awareness is the light that illumines the mind, enabling the mind to know other things. Mind means ego in this context, and enabling the mind to know other things. So the witness in the sense of the knower is ego. The reality of that ego is the ultimate witness, the pure awareness. That is why the term witness is used both to refer to our real nature, which is pure awareness, and ego, because ultimately they're one and the same. Jiva Brahmaikya, they're not two separate things. Why we seem to be Jiva now and not Brahman is because we're looking outwards. If we look within, we will see this very same Jiva, but seem to be Jiva, is actually nothing but Brahman. So the reason why the Sastras talk about Sakshi is they're trying to turn our attention back towards ourselves, towards the one who is aware of all these things. If we attend to one who is aware of all these things, ego will subside and merge back into its source, which is pure awareness, and pure awareness alone will remain. So the ultimate Sakshi is that pure awareness. We reach that by going through this superficial Sakshi ego, but the pure awareness means awareness that is not aware of anything other than itself. Ego is the impure awareness that is aware of other things. So there's a though, as Bhagavan said, the term Sakshi is used in two different senses. These two senses are very closely related, because if we look at the superficial Sakshi, the knower of all other things, we'll see the underlying Sakshi, which is the pure awareness. I hope that adequately answered that question. I think I've finished the 5 minutes are up. Shall I try and do the other question, or should we leave that till next time?
Let's try and respond to that quite briefly, sir.
Okay. Sushil Motwani has asked, Namo Ramanaya, Michael, sir, is Shrishti Utpatti Krama before Ahankara comes Mahat? What is Mahat, and what is its place in self-investigation and self-realization? Okay, all these things about Mahat and Virat and all these terms, this is basically Sankhya philosophy. This Sankhya philosophy is often for people who first come to Advaita, they're often taught a mixture of Vedanta and Sankhya, but all these things are unnecessary. That is, the Sankhya has classified so many different tattvas. I think 20. That is, the two basic tattvas are Purusha and Prakriti, and Prakriti is divided into a further 24 tattvas. Tattvas in this context mean the basic realities, but according to Bhagavan, there is only one tattva, Tane tattvam. Oneself alone is the reality. So in Nana, Bhagavan says, all the other tattvas, the tattvas talked about by Sankhya and even in certain Vedanta texts, all these are anatma. They're all other than ourselves. So our aim is, they're all rubbish. Rubbish is to be discarded. when Bhagavan first gave answers to Shiv Prakasham Pillai in this regard, Bhagavan used an analogy, but he simplified it when he wrote it in an essay form. The analogy he used in originally, he says, the hair in a barber shop. At the end of a day's work, what is a barber to do with all the hair on the floor? He has to sweep it all up, put it in a bin bag and throw it away. It has to be discarded. There's no point in analyzing how many black hairs, how many gray hairs, how many red hairs, how many blonde hairs, how many curly hairs, how many straight hairs, how many thick hairs, how many thin hairs, how many short hairs, long hairs. All analyzing the hair, which is all rubbish, but is to be thrown away, is futile. Equally futile is it to analyze all these tattvas, because these tattvas are concealing our real nature, because they are not real tattvas. According to Bhagavan, the only real tattva is ourself. So when we seek to know ourselves, we don't. It is unnecessary to analyze all these tattvas. This may be taught in texts like Vedanta Sara, which are primary textbooks when people come to learn Vedanta. They teach all these things, but it's actually unnecessary. Bhagavan has simplified it. He said there's only one real tattva, that is ourself. The only tattva we need to know is ourself. All the other tattvas are to be discarded like the rubbish in a barber shop. So we need not worry about all these things. According to Bhagavan, that is according to Sankhya, from Prakriti first comes Mahat and something. I can't remember all the tattvas, but Ahankara comes Ahankara comes after Buddhi. Or after, I think the word for Buddhi, I've forgotten what it's called. I've forgotten all these terms. But Ahankara comes only second or third or fourth in the list. Whereas according to Bhagavan, Ahankara is the root. Everything, as he says in verse 26 of Uladunapadu, Ahandayundayan Anatamundaham. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Ego itself is everything. Therefore, investigating what this ego is the putting an end to everything. It's the cessation of everything. It's giving up everything. So according to Bhagavan, ego is the root. Everything else comes after ego. If we investigate ego, we find that it is nothing but pure awareness. That is, now we seem to be ego because we're looking outwards. If we look back to see who am I, this ego disappears and pure awareness alone remains. That is all we need to know. So let us not worry about all these classifications given in Sankhya and even in preliminary textbooks of Vedanta. Bhagavan has made it much, much simpler for us. Bhagavan doesn't want to burden us learning about things which we are anyway to forget about. What is the use of knowing about all these tattvas? Are any of these tattvas ourselves? Even according to Sankhya, all these, the only tattva that is ourself is Purusha. All Prakriti and all the other tattvas are something other than ourselves. So the aim in Sankhya is to separate Purusha from Prakriti. So why to worry about Prakriti? Let's investigate the Purusha. But according to Advaita, is a much deeper philosophy than Sankhya, because according to Advaita, Prakriti, all the phenomena, the objects, exist only in the view of the subject, the Purusha. And even Purusha is not the ultimate reality. The reality, Purusha is the subject, Prakriti are the objects. But according to Advaita, neither the objects nor the subject is real. What is real is the essence of the subject. The subject is ego, chit jada granti. What is real is only the chit element. So we need to go within to investigate our own chitva. That's all we need to. So we let us forget about all these. If you want to study philosophy, all the different systems of philosophy. There are innumerable different systems of philosophy. I mean, they've been classified as the the Astika and Nastika philosophies, and the Astika philosophies are classified as Nyaya, Vaiseshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Purva Mimamsa, Uttara Mimamsa is our Vedanta. And even Vedanta, there are so many different types of Vedanta. We can spend lifetimes studying philosophy, but what is the use? Philosophy is useful only to the extent to which it turns our attention back to ourselves to know who am I. Because what is the ultimate question asked by any true philosophy is who am I? Until we know ourselves, knowing about everything else is of no use. Because how can we know the value of any knowledge we have about anything other than ourselves when we don't even know ourselves? So first and foremost, we need to know ourselves. As Bhagavan says in Amma Viday, what is the use of knowing all else when one doesn't know oneself? And when we know ourselves, what else is there to know? So the only thing but worth knowing, the only tattva worth knowing is the one real tattva, that is ourself. All other tattvas are unreal and are to be discarded like rubbish in a barber shop. I hope that adequately answers that question. I don't answer the question because answering the question directly is unnecessary. It's just a distraction. Bhagavan has made things so simple and clear for us to avoid all this confusion created by all these terms. The only thing Bhagavan asks us to know is who am I? We need not know anything else whatsoever. All Bhagavan's other teachings are just to point us back to the need to know who am I. So the essence of Bhagavan's teaching is who am I? If we know who we are, everything is known. In one of the Upanishads, I can't remember which one, the question asked is, what is that knowing which everything is known? That is ourself. You are that, Tattvamasi. So we need not know anything else other than ourselves. Because if we know ourselves, we know everything. I hope that is an adequate answer to that question. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya.
Namo Ramana sir, and thank you so much once again for a wonderful session. Any further questions for Mr. Michael James, please feel free to send them over through WhatsApp or email, and I'm sure he would be happy to take them up in the next sessions. So we will meet you again next month.
Yes.
Thank you. Narayananji, I would now request you to initiate Akshar Manamalai and Arati.
கருணாகரமுனி ரமணாரியங்குவ கயினால் சொல்லியது கதியாக அருணாச்சலமென அகமே அறிவேன் ஆழ்வார் சிவனுது ஆழ்வாரே. அருணாச்சலோருக்கேற்ற அக்ஷரமணமாலை சாற்ற கருணாகர கணபதியே கரமருளி காப்பாயே. அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சலம் என அகமே நினைப்பவர் அகத்தை வேறறுப்பாய் அருணாச்சலா. அழகு சுந்தரம் அகமும் தினமாயிருப்போம் அருணாச்சலா. அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா. அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா. அகமுதீர்த்தும் அகதுரை சிறையாய் அமர்வித்ததென்பல் அருணாச்சலா. ஆறு ஆயனை ஆண்டனை அகற்றி அதிலம் கழித்திடும் அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல இப்பழித்த முனை நினைப்பித்தார் இனி யார் விடுவார் அருணாச்சலா ஈவிடும் மன்னை தெரிதருள் புரிவு இது உனதருள் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா உன்னையே மாற்றி கோராதுள்ளத்தின் மேல் உறுதி இருப்பார் அருணாச்சலா சுற்று உளம்பிடார் உன்னை கண்டு அழகை காத்தருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா என்னை அழித்தி என்னை கலவாவிடு இதுவோ ஆண்மை அருணாச்சலா ஏன் இந்த உறக்கம் என்னை பிறருக்க இது உனக்கழகோ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா ஐம்புல கழ்வர் அகத்தினில் புகுமோ அகத்தில் நீ இல்லையோ அருணாச்சலா ஒருவன் நாம் உன்னை ஒழித்தவர் வருவார் உன் சோலை இது அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா ஓங்காரம் ஒரு உயர்வில்லோ உன்னை யார் அறிவார் அருணாச்சலா அவ்வை போல் எனக்கு அருளை தந்து என ஆழ்வது உன் கடன் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சலம் வாழி அன்பர்களும் வாழி அக்ஷரமணமகனே दीपार्थं समर्पयामि दीपार्थं समर्पयामि भूर्भुवस्सुः तस्सोतमोनियं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात् देवसवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो प्रचोदयामि अमृतं स्वाहा प्राणाय स्वाहा महापानाय स्वाहा ज्ञानाय स्वाहा उदानाय स्वाहा समानाय स्वाहा ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा करुणातु श्रीरमणाय नमः करुणातु श्रीरमणाय नमः करुणातु श्रीरमणाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम नमः शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः ओम शिवाय नमः नाट्यचक्रे नैवेद्यं समर्पयामि मध्ये मध्ये पानीयं समर्पयामि अमृतोत्तरवसं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनानन्तरं आसमनीयं समर्पयामि जीवन समाप्तं नागवल्लीतरेवं कर्पूर्णसूर्यसमेतं दुर्गां कर्पूरनीराजनं श्रीरत्नमर्शित्य समर्पयामि। ओम नमो भगवते श्रीरत्नाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्रीरत्नाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्रीरत्नाय नमः। आदित्याय नमः, रुद्राय नमः, देवाय नमः, सुब्रह्मण्याय नमः, स्वामिनाथने नमः, दक्षिणामूर्तये नमः, दत्तात्रेय नमः, भैरवे नमः, नंदीमहेश्वराय नमः, शिवपार्वतीये नमः। ओम नमः शिवाय नमः। ओम नमः शिवाय नमः। ओम नमः शिवाय नमः। ओम शिवाय नमः। ओम शिवाय नमः। ओम शिवाय नमः। ओम वायुस्य राजमातस्ते तो राजा सन राजवा सोने दिए देवस्वामिनामि अमिति भवन्ति वेदावन्दो वै देवानां स्वा ते वासरितां करिष्यन्ति ते नमस्तवन्दे राजाय देवराजा भवतु तदप्रभुयो वानरन्दकार हेमाविष्णुवादित्वादित्वं तमेवानुमन्वान् सर्वं दस्यमाता सर्वं दन्वादि कर्पूरनीराजनं यमनमर्चिति पुष्पं वेद पुष्पवान् प्रजावान् पशुमान् भवति चन्द्रमा पुष्पं पुष्पमुष्मान् प्रजावान् पशुमान् भवति ओं तद्ब्रह्मा ओं तद्वायु ओं तदात्मा ओं तत्सत्यं ओं तत्सर्वं ओं तत्पुरो नमः अन्तर्निपूतेश गुहायां पुष्पमुक्तिषु त्वमेवनस्तं वसन्तारस्तं नित्यस्तं रुद्रस्तं विष्णुस्तं ब्रह्मस्तं प्रजापति ओं तथा भवतु कुरुस्व न कर्मणा न प्रजया जने नित्यानेके अमृतत्वमानसु परेण नाहं नीतं गुहायं विभ्राजते यत्यदयो विसन्ति वेदान्त विज्ञानसे नित्यदाता संन्यास योगातने शुद्धसत्त्वाः ते ब्रह्मलोके तु परान्तकाले परामुक्तात् परिमुच्यन्ति सर्वे कारं विपापं परमेश्वरमूलं यत्पुण्डरीकं पुरमत्य सदुःसदं तत्रावित्तकरमकरं विसोगस् तस्मिन् यदन्तद्दुबादित्यं यो वेदादौ सुरप्रोक्तो वेदान्तस्य प्रतिष्ठितः तस्य प्रकृतितस्य परसमहेश्वरः मङ्गलपुष्पं श्रीरमणमहर्षिक्यं मङ्गलपुष्पं श्रीकार्तिकाय मुरुगावली दैवानिक्यं मङ्गलपुष्पं शिवपार्वतीक्यं समर्पयामि। ॐ तत्सद्ब्रह्मार्पणमस्तु। हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम हरि ओम।
Namo Ramana. This brings us to the closure of today's satsang with Mr. Michael James. We shall reconvene next Sunday with Raghavji. Namo Ramana.